In November, Supreme Court justices will hear the first case on gun rights in America in over a decade. A ruling on the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin could fundamentally change our concealed carry laws. That decision will come after a record year in gun sales and as more women and people of color become gun owners for the first time. This is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're listening back to a show that aired in March when we learned that gun sales skyrocketed during the pandemic. And although gun sales have dropped in 2021, they are still higher than pre-pandemic levels. The largest increase in gun purchases in 2020 was by African Americans. Later in the show, we'll dig deeper into those numbers and we'll talk to a legal scholar who argues that the Second Amendment doesn't equally protect people of color. But first, we want to explore gun culture here in Connecticut. Will Hampton joins us now. He's chapter president of the Black Gun Owners Association of Norwalk and owner of the Gullah Warriors Gun Club in Lower Fairfield County. Will, welcome to Disrupted.
I appreciate you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. Now, you've had your pistol permit for over 20 years. Talk to us about what made you decide that you wanted to take that step to become a licensed gun owner.
Initially, it was an interest in the shooting sports, which is the fun, not so self-defense centered side of it. But also prior to graduating high school, buried two best friends to gun violence and also had a gun, drawn on me, my brother, and my two cousins once while we were just minding our own business. So, coming to the conclusion early that we don't live in a perfect world.
There's a lot of discussion in the U.S. about gun culture. And for me, as someone who grew up in the South, what gun culture looks like there is quite different from what we may encounter in Connecticut. And you just talked about the enthusiasm and gun sports, but also safety and protection. So what would you say gun culture looks like here in Connecticut?
We can't negate or neglect, what violence takes place in certain cities. That's an issue and it's sad, but it definitely correlates with lack of jobs and opportunity. It's no coincidence that, some of the highest crime-ridden areas are also those who with the poorest education. They don't make as much. The median home income is the lowest in the country. And for places like Detroit, a definite spike in crime the minute jobs left. So that's definitely one side of it. But gun culture is, fun. It's target practice. It's, competing, learning about safety, learning about different platforms. Most people start with a pistol, then they graduate to either a rifle or a shotgun. Just at the, we have a Sunday gun day every second Sunday of each month. And two of the sisters fell in love with a shotgun and a 12 gauge shotgun at that, because a lot of times there used to be a lot of negative connotations with what caliber a woman can or can't handle. And I don't really buy that. I was raised by my mom and my grandmother and they're tough. So I didn't buy that at all. So, they fell in love with the 12 gauge shotgun and it's all just practice, safe technique and form. So they're ready to skip pistols and just go, they're pros now in their own head. But we have a lot of fun. We talk about, especially a lot of people now that are coming to me, because I'm also a firearms instructor, about race and the issues that have been revealed. I don't think it's anything new, but that have been revealed in this last year.
So I want to talk about these sort of new trends that we're seeing over the past year. But I want to go back to something that you just said about being an instructor. Why the move from being an enthusiast to now owning a gun club, being an instructor, and opening up membership to people who want to do this safely, but also want to be a part of a club?
I thought the concept of a club was always cool. I just never looked at it as being something locally that, at first I was looking to join, but I didn't see, when I first had these thoughts, there were no NAGA or BGOA. So it was just kind of like getting together with fellas that also have their permit. But, with me really taking that step was in direct response to the Ahmaud Arbery situation, which involved retired police, but they were protected literally by the local prosecutors, and just that the way it was handled was as if we were still living in the 30s. And it was then where I came to the conclusion that certain aspects of this government society does not have my best interests at hand, even when the right thing is done. Same with Philando Castile. So I knew how many people I can count on one hand who had the permit, and I know how many conversations I've had with our people in regards to their fears, concerns, and drawing more attention and things like that. So I really wanted to walk the walk and dispel some of the myths. And the Ahmaud Arbery situation, him running and minding his business, by day I'm a personal trainer, so that could have easily been me, and that resonated with me big time. So I figure instead of just go on rants online, I'd rather do something, at least on a local level.
So NAGA, for our listeners, is the National African American Gun Association. And when most people in this country think about a gun rights organization or a group of people who want to use that, they think of the NRA, the National Rifle Association. But you're mentioning these two national organizations that you've started, local chapters, who address both the social context for African Americans, but also that sort of camaraderie of understanding how these things overlap. Why was it important for you to start a chapter that focuses on African American gun owners?
Because it's a different experience for us in this country. A lot of our plight, things have changed a lot based off of us taking up arms. It was one of the only forms of protection against the Klan. Rosa Parks chased the Klan away from her porch. A good amount of times. We never hear that part. As we discussed before, when Black men got the right to vote, it was Black women surrounding those voting booths with guns and firearms to fight the Klan off. A lot of the legitimate legislation that came following, like the Black Panthers, and a lot of their stances, came based off of a fear that needed to be created, unfortunately, for us to get the rights and respect that, we're still kind of fighting to have. So locally is just a continuation of that discussion, that fight, and making sure that, we take our safety into our own hands, whether it's on an individual level or as a collective.
We saw a 60% increase in Black gun ownership in 2020. And some of that is driven by the things that you discussed, the historic nature in which many Black communities felt unprotected or unsafe, but also the changing disruptions of this pandemic that made some people say, I need to do something differently. Are you seeing that same sort of trend in Connecticut, whether it's membership in your organization or just the conversations you have with people who want to pursue their permits?
Definitely. A lot of the membership is driven based off of the revelations of this previous administration and year. And then as far as Connecticut, I would assume, because there are definitely other chapters that are popping up. Hartford area has one. So I would assume it's pretty parallel going across the board, and, somewhat of an awakening taking place for the most part with our people, and gun rights and protection, and just, it's your sovereign right to protect your life. And that's just, where it, starts and stops for me.
One of the challenges that often emerges when groups and communities mobilize to protect themselves is that it can also spark fear amongst other people. Do you have a concern that this increase in gun ownership may spark that kind of retaliation? Or are you more focused on how communities come together to protect and affirm themselves?
More concerned with how communities come together to protect themselves. I really don't care about anyone else's fear, because we've exhausted all means of, just gradually assimilating into, just Western society, and like I said, based off of, my upbringing is the church, and, it's always been just a passive turn the other cheek type of approach. So, to even have this conversation in 2020 in itself is telling. So, yeah, I could really care less about anyone else's fear, because those who know me, as I said, I'm a personal trainer. Most of my clients are white. They know Will, and we have the same conversations. I've actually had more conversations with my white friends asking, honest questions about race that otherwise would have been either work inappropriate, or they just didn't think about because it didn't affect them. And I don't blame them for that. Why would they? We live in, a white man's world, basically. And, it's truly about us, with love for everyone, but it's truly about us right about now.
One of the benefits of many that have come out of these disruptions during these pandemics is that, as you say, we're having more conversations, not just conversations with people of similar backgrounds, but across the lines that traditionally divide us. What's the conversation that you have with young people who see the spikes in violence happening in Connecticut and across the country, who shoulder this fear that their very body or their very presence may be viewed negatively, or that they fear for their lives? What's the conversation that we should be having with young people around guns and gun safety?
First of all, I think the conversation should be centered around their most powerful weapon, and that's their mind. And knowing that, whether from a self-defense standpoint, walking away is always the first and most important option. But, when people we love spewing how our ancestors died for this, died for that. No, they died for you to be able to walk this planet fearless. So, doing what we have to do to protect ourselves, to start, investing in our own and things like that needs to be, the main focus. Violence on the gun violence side, that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But us, coming together as a community, creating our own businesses, jobs, corporations, and then employing those same very individuals has a huge potential to change, our realities as we know it. There's a huge buy back the block movement going on in a lot of different cities, and I'm loving it because, it's kind of offsetting the gentrification that is definitely taking place in, like, my city, Norwalk, and a lot of surrounding cities.
Will Hampton is president of the Black Gun Owners Association of Norwalk and owner of the Gullah Warriors Gun Club in Lower Fairfield County. Will, thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Coming up, we'll dig deeper into some of the statistics we heard earlier in the show, and we'll hear how the Second Amendment often fails to protect African Americans. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the disruptions around gun ownership last year. It's typical for gun purchases to increase in the winter months and during times of unrest, but 2020 really piled on. Lakeisha Chavis is a reporter at The Trace. It's a news organization reporting on America's gun violence crisis. She told me that 2020 was a record year for guns, with about 22 million legal purchases. I asked her to talk more about the trends she's seeing.
2020 wasn't just an election year, it was an unprecedented year of just so many things that people did not anticipate, like the pandemic. And with that, you have increased stress, increased anxiety. And so you just have this boom in legal gun purchases as well. And separate from that, we also have an increase in violent crime. And, I think it was just a mix where people felt like their safety was really compromised. There was so much job insecurity, housing insecurity caused by the pandemic. And it's really too early to tell if any of this is related to legal gun sales and the violence that we were seeing. But both things, did occur in a way that I think shocked reporters covering this issue, as well as researchers and policymakers.
There's a lot of fear and a lot of vulnerability for a number of reasons being felt widely across the country. but there's also particular dynamics happening for communities of color related to the events of last year and even now in 2021. What are the trends that you are seeing amongst communities of color in relation to these issues that you report on?
Yeah, so when we talk about gun sales increasing across the country, which is what happened during the pandemic, no state was left untouched by these spikes in gun purchases. But I think oftentimes it is framed through a lens of white men living in rural areas purchasing guns. But that is not always the case. And so what we saw in 2020 was really an uptick in people from different communities of color wanting to be gun owners. And in their words, they really wanted to exercise, their Second Amendment rights. And so we saw, people in affiliated groups, so groups dedicated to Black gun ownership, Latinx gun ownership, and in some Asian communities as well, people wanting to buy guns.
We've also seen an increase in hate crimes and bias crimes targeting particular communities. And I'm thinking here of the spike in anti-Asian sentiment and violence. Do you think that that social context is driving some of this, or is it more about affirming one's citizenship and access to those rights and protections?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those things are intertwined. And for the increase in hate crimes against Asian communities in this country, what one of my colleagues reported early on in the pandemic is that in certain parts of the country, gun store owners were really seeing an increase in people from Asian communities wanting to purchase guns, and they were very scared. And when you look at the context in which this was happening, you had a presidential administration that really spewed very, racist things about the coronavirus and its origins. And so it's not surprising in some ways that we're seeing this increase. And the number one reason that people want guns in this country is for self-protection. And that has been the most common reason for decades now.
It's interesting how racial and ethnic identity shapes access, but also shapes purpose. I think that we have a racialized notion of, white men perhaps engaging in this for sport and for enthusiasm, and for communities of color, it's more about protection. But much of your reporting also focuses on the negative outcomes of this, the spikes, as you say, in violence, but also the dramatic increase in people who are dying by suicide as the result of guns and gun violence. What are you seeing in your reporting?
Yeah, so it's really hard to connect legal gun purchases that happened last year to the violence that we're seeing. So in some ways it's separate because guns that might be used in a crime later on tend to be, at least in Chicago, I'll say, tend to be about a decade old. But what we also saw this year in Chicago was a, spike in suicides among Black people in the Chicago area. And that is also something that people weren't anticipating. And when we look at just suicides in general across the country, the common method used is often with a firearm. And that is because firearms are just so deadly. It's very, very hard to come back from a firearm injury. So it plays a huge role in suicides as well.
Let's talk a little bit about Chicago, because Chicago often comes up in national conversation, but it comes up as this throwaway example of look at Chicago. And it doesn't really address the people of Chicago and the conditions that people are navigating. What's happening in the city that you think, or from your research and your journalism, what's happening in Chicago that may be leading to some of these spikes?
Yeah, so when we talk about things like gun violence or mental health, I think it's really important to talk about all of the different issues that make violence more likely. So things like poverty, things like unstable housing situations, job attainment, wealth attainment. When you don't have the resources to make all of that possible, it puts you at a higher risk of not only victimization, but perhaps being a perpetrator of violence as well. So when we talk about Chicago, it's important to remember that this is one of the most segregated cities in the country. When we see things like gun violence and mental health crises that are happening, we see it in the same areas of the city over and over again. And then you throw in things like the pandemic. The first wave of the coronavirus really devastated communities that were already highly affected by violence.
So what's being done? What's being done to address this in Chicago or perhaps in other parts of the country that are grappling with these same challenges?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that I noted last year was just the increase in reliance on street outreach workers. This is sometimes referred to as violence interruption. So you really had cities relying on people who are considered sort of credible messengers in their community. These are people that, at least in Chicago, they often grew up in the neighborhoods that they now work in. Sometimes they have had very close experiences with gun violence, either as a victim and or as a perpetrator. And they are now trying to make a difference in the communities that they serve. And so what you saw during the pandemic is that they took on things like COVID outreach, letting people know that this virus was real and how people could protect themselves, as well as lately training outreach workers to spot signs of domestic violence as well, in addition to all of the other work that they've been doing. And I will say that street outreach, especially in Chicago, is not new. It's been around for several decades, but during the pandemic, you just really saw a reliance on, from government institutions on these workers, because they were the closest to the ground and they really could say, what was happening, what people knew, and what resources that they needed.
There's been a lot of concern about, not just in Chicago, but across the country, about young people not being in schools. How are these organizations, whether it's the street outreach workers or other community organizations, how are they connecting with young people?
Yeah, so I think in Chicago, there are lots of groups that are working with children, either, young children and teenagers are being referred to their organizations, or they're, out in the community trying to meet them and offer them things like help with school, mental health resources, and access to food and things like that. And what I'm hearing from people who do this work every day is that really it's not just, addressing the child's needs, but trying to figure out how to help the family as a whole. As you mentioned, there's just so much stress happening, and sometimes that trickles down to children as well. So really trying to address the family unit, everyone living in that house, to in some ways directly assist the child as well.
There's often a lot of attention paid when we have mass acts of gun violence. And in particular, I'm thinking of school-based shootings. And one of the benefits of this pandemic is that that has not happened at the level that we have seen in years past. But it also means that, as you mentioned in your work, we need to start addressing the why and the context. Lakedra Chavis is a reporter at The Trace. It's a news organization that reports on America's gun violence crisis. Lakedra, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, the right to bear arms is written in our Constitution, but is it the reality on the ground for many Black Americans? And if you or a loved one is struggling with suicidal thoughts, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. 2020 was a record year for gun purchases, but it was also a year of racial reckonings. So many names have become all too familiar. Philando Castile, Jamel Robinson, Amantic Bradford, they're all Black men who were carrying firearms legally, yet all shot and killed by police in the last decade. Margaret Etienne is a law professor, associate dean, and the Nancy Snowden Research Scholar at the University of Illinois College of Law. She's also an expert on the history and legacy of gun policy in the U.S. I asked her to talk about the history of the Second Amendment and how understanding that history is critical to making sense of this current moment.
So the Second Amendment, obviously, it's part of the Bill of Rights, and it guarantees the right to bear arms. And there's questions about who gets to bear arms and is it an absolute right? There's a lot of language or constraints that people talk about that don't necessarily appear in the language of the amendment, but have come about over time through various case law and legislation. And there's a very long history to the idea of gun ownership that well precedes the Second Amendment itself.
The language of the Second Amendment is incredibly brief, and yet, as you mentioned, has sparked really decades and centuries of debate and conflict about what it means. Some of us are familiar with the murder of Philando Castile in Minneapolis, or the murder of John Crawford in Ohio, who had picked up a pellet gun in the store and then was shot and killed by an officer. Those are the contemporary examples where people have argued the Second Amendment does not protect Black gun owners. But you say that there's a much longer history of having that unequal protection. What's that bigger picture and that historical background that we need to know?
I think I should start with a clarification that we as lawyers, as law scholars, often notice that there's a difference between the law as it's written and the law as it's practiced, how we think about it, the law on the ground. And so it's great to start with the text of the Second Amendment. And of course, the text itself says nothing about restricting the rights of African Americans or any particular group from owning guns. But we can see that the way in which that right is protected or not protected says something about whether we recognize a Second Amendment right for all people. And it's clear in the examples that you raised, the more recent examples, but also historically, that Blacks have not traditionally had their Second Amendment rights protected. So they exist on the books, of course, but they're not necessarily recognized. And so historically, from the very beginning of this foundation of this country, as I was alluding to before, the rights of gun owners have been quite racialized. The idea that guns were rampant and everyone owned a gun at the founding of this country is not accurate. In colonies in general, the Crown, in this case, that the colonizer, the British Crown, has reason to want to limit gun ownership within the colonies. Colonists who came in appealed to the British Crown, to the government there, saying, we actually need guns. We need guns because we have different constraints, different issues than other colonies might have. We've got the indigenous population, we've got the Black population, we've got indentured servant, the poor white population. And in order to maintain some control, we're going to need to be able to bear arms. And so from the very beginning, the idea that some people could own guns in the colonies and some people could not own guns was very clear. Moving forward, there's still a long history, particularly dealing with African Americans who were, of course, restricted from owning firearms, and their rights were limited in many ways that go far beyond the Second Amendment, as we know. But that started to change over time. Particularly, we see a shift in the Civil War, where for the first time, Blacks were fighting for the Union, for the United States Army, and were armed and allowed to be armed. And that sight, I imagine, was one of the scariest sights that a sort of Southern slave owner would encounter, right? As a Black person with a gun.
I find that history both fascinating and infuriating. The notion that the colonists said they needed guns to protect from these external threats posed by indigenous nations and from Blacks who were in the colonies at the time, and that there gradually becomes greater acceptance once those soldiers are taking up arms in order to preserve the Confederacy and to protect that interest. But that difference between who poses a threat versus who deserves to be protected, as you said, persists. And one of the things that also appears in your work is this notion of how people respond to movements and respond to demands for freedom. How then has the Second Amendment been used to stop movements or to deter people? You mentioned some of the slave rebellions. How has the Second Amendment been used in that context?
So at that point, during the time of slavery, there wasn't really a case made that Blacks had a right to own guns, or that the Second Amendment applied to them. So this was not necessarily a shift between the law on the books and the law in practice. What we saw was that shift started to occur when, in fact, it became clear that Blacks would be recognized as full Americans with all of the rights. There was a strong disconnect between that historical experience of not seeing Black people own guns lawfully to seeing Black people own guns lawfully. And yet, this almost national memory of the fact that if a Black person is owning a gun, there's something gone amiss. There's something wrong with that, and that was a violent act in and of itself. Right, the possession of a firearm is viewed in Black hands as in and of itself a threat, whereas we don't necessarily see that being the case when a white American, for example, is owning a gun. Now, I'll say that the idea of gun ownership and the restrictions that ought to be placed or not is a controversial subject. So, of course, there are many people who see anyone with a gun as a threat. But among those who petition for and champion the rights of gun ownership, oftentimes Black folks are left outside of those appeals and those petitions. When we think about the NRA and their very strong advocacy for gun rights across, historically, and the sense that oftentimes African Americans have felt very excluded. Those who want to own guns lawfully have felt very excluded from that movement, and have started gun ownership associations of their own. In fact, in the last year or two, what we're seeing is a massive increase in membership in the National African American Gun Association. And what we're seeing is increases 30, 50, 70% increased membership in those organizations. And in part because many of these people haven't felt welcome in the NRA and that movement.
The beauty of the Constitution is that it is a living document, that there's always this debate over interpretation. But there's also, as you say, this difference between rights on the books and rights in person. And often the person who gets to decide those rights on the ground has a sense of power that others may not. And we add the layer of race that really makes a difference. Professor, a lot of people talked about the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol and how differently that may have looked if the people engaging in those treasonous acts had been African Americans, and would the response be different? So I'll ask that question to you. Do you think that the response would have been different, or do you think that the question that we should be asking is more about why certain people are allowed to present in that way and others are not?
Obviously, we're engaging in a bit of speculation, but if asked to go down that route, I have no doubt that the response would have been quite different had the group of insurrectionists been largely people of color, Black or otherwise. I think the response would have been different. I think it never would have gotten as far as it did. And I think the reaction post January 6th would have been quite different as well in terms of the not only the prosecution, the arrests, but the public response and outcry would have been far, far greater. And we would have seen the impact of that for many, many years to come. And we can see that playing out. So even in some of the examples that you mentioned, we have examples of African American, mostly men in these cases, owning firearms, licensed gun owners who, when seen in public, for example, in a mall or in a nightclub, as soon as they are viewed with a firearm, the assumption is that they are the villains, they're the bad guys, they're up to no good, and that they must be stopped. And not necessarily stopped and questioned, but stopped and killed, assassinated in a sense. So I think that we have some evidence that folks are being treated very differently. And you're absolutely right to point out that in that moment, right, when we're not in a court of law, but on the streets, and the law is being applied, that there is a big differential of power. And those with the power are not viewing the Second Amendment right in a non-racialized manner.
There's a lot of public frustration about that disconnect, to think about the fact that we've been grappling with these dual pandemics, one of COVID-19, but also the racial tensions that have often resulted in deaths and violence toward African Americans. And one of the examples that you mention in your work is the response to Kyle Rittenhouse, this, young white man who shot and killed people. And the response has been very different, as opposed to, as you talk about, Amantic Bradford, who was really a hero trying to protect other people, but was shot and killed because the reaction to his presence was very different. How do we grapple with that tension, not just in public conversation, but in working to ensure that the law protects everyone equally and doesn't prioritize people based on their perceived racial identity or worth?
There is a lot of work to be done in this area, and it needs to happen on many different fronts. So, of course, law enforcement is often the first respondents in something like this, and they need to be trained. It's not clear that training alone will do it. In fact, many think about training as a panacea that doesn't really solve any problems, but that would be one step. But the visibility of licensed legal Black gun ownership has to be part of the solution. So we need to democratize our view of who the gun owner is. So that would be one step. How we do that, again, that's a multi-pronged, we need to have a multi-pronged approach to that. But the problem that we're talking about has been a problem for a very long time. And I often think about a quote, by James Baldwin. He says, when a white person picks up a gun and says, "Give me liberty or give me death," the entire white world applauds. When a Black man says exactly the same thing, he is judged a criminal and treated like one. And that quote was true then, and it's true now. And it's hard to imagine a world sometime soon where that's going to be different.
When we think about the role of the courts in not just protecting the Second Amendment or interpreting the Second Amendment, but really affirming the meaning of citizenship in the United States, is there a particular issue or set of issues related to the Second Amendment that you think we should expect the court to take up, or that you would want the court to address?
I would say that the concept of the Second Amendment and thinking about really gun control laws, right? Because that's where much of the debate is what is an appropriate level of gun control that violates or doesn't violate the Second Amendment. And I would think that the courts can think about whether or not gun control, the history itself of gun control laws should be part of the way that we view the amendment and what those gun control laws should contain. As I mentioned, gun control laws preceded the framing. We had gun control laws before we had a constitution. And so to think about this notion that somehow the Second Amendment should be protected even from any regulation is something that I think courts can look at. And to add to that, the equalization of the application of the amendment is really, thinking about how equal protection might apply, for example, to the Second Amendment in terms of how states and how law enforcement agencies conceive of the Second Amendment and go beyond the text to see how they actually enforce it and how it's applied, how they enforce the gun control laws and how those are applied would be things that can be done.
Professor Margaret Etienne is professor at the University of Illinois College of Law. She's also Associate Dean and the Nancy Snowden Research Scholar. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
This episode was originally produced by Daniela Luna and Anna Elizabeth. The rest of our team includes James Szkobel-Wolff, Zshekinah Collier, and Catie Talarski. Our interns are Abe Levine and Dylan Reyes. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.